My name is Megan McKinney. I'm the Associate Director of the Duck Career Network in the UO Alumni Association. Despite moving into a fully digital space this past year, we in the Alumni Association are still working hard to provide our ducks with both regional and informative programming like this webinar, as well as virtual career networking opportunities. And we're really looking forward to sharing with you some of our new offerings in the next several months. I also want to say thank you to Lauren Barclay and Caitlin Elwood, my colleagues in University Advancement, who have been busy behind the scenes to help make this webinar possible. I am thrilled that we have an experienced panel of 4 Duck alumni with us, as well as a UO professor who are here to share their insights and perspectives for the tech industry in the next year, 2021 and beyond. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be covering a lot of ground in hopes of bringing clarity to our near future in technology. Our panel will help identify tech trends impacting the economic, business, political, and remote work environment, as well as highlight some bright spots and opportunities within the industry. I want to encourage audience members to submit your questions for our panel using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Toward the end of the program, we'll open the floor to our panelists to answer as many audience questions as time allows. And now I would like to introduce to you our moderator for today, Nick McElveen, founder and managing director of Embarca Tech. Nick holds a degree from the UO in journalism and communications. His career has spanned the mobile, e-commerce, fintech, and payments industries throughout the Americas and Asia. He's now building his own startup company in the personal data privacy field while also advising companies in high-tech growth sectors. Nick, I'm going to hand it over to you now to begin the program and kick off our panel discussions.
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here with you folks today. A little bit about Ducks in Tech. We are University of Oregon alumni, helping other alumni in the technology industry, providing advice and experience in career growth, sharing industry knowledge, and creating networking opportunities. We want to make it easier for others to succeed in their business, in their careers. And Ducks in Tech and the UO Alumni Association want to help you make better decisions in your job, for your organization, and also in your career. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and then we will go into a presentation, and then all of the panelists will join us. First, we have Marianne Patel, VP Product Management for Salesforce, and specifically the Sales Cloud, based here in San Francisco, as I am here today. And we've got Shanti Burgal, Managing Director of Transcend Fund in London. Thank you for joining us late in your evening, Shanti. And Yvonne Yang, Director of Chrome Hardware Development in the Client Computing Group of the Intel Corporation. And last but not least, we have Professor Tim Dewey. He's a professor of practice and Senior Director of the Oregon Economic Forum at the University of Oregon, also the author of Tim Dewey's FedWatch, and also a frequent contributor to Bloomberg. With that, I will hand the baton over to you, Professor Dewey, for the next 15 minutes. Please go ahead, Professor Dewey, and share your video and audio. And if we can do that. And Professor Dewey, please help us set the stage for our discussion about the year to come in both business as well as the tech industry. As you begin your presentation, please also tell us a little bit more about, tell the audience a bit more about yourself and the various roles at the U of O you have and elsewhere. I'll rejoin you folks in 15 minutes, and we'll pass it off to Professor Dewey. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me just fine. And I hope everyone can see my slides. And if somebody can't, please let me know quickly. You know, what I forgot to mention, or we didn't mention, is I am also a University of Oregon alumni. I did get my PhD at the University of Oregon. So I guess everybody on this panel is an alumni. So glad to have us all here. I'm gonna get started here from my slides. I've been calling this After the Fall, the Pandemic Recovery. Giving a sense of how the economy is going to proceed over the course of 2021 and 2022. I do a lot of things here at the university. I teach, I do advising for students. I do outreach, and this is obviously part of the outreach efforts I do. So I give a lot of these kinds of talks to local communities. So whether it be Rotary clubs or businesses or chambers of commerce or this event, I very much enjoy being able to reach out to the community and provide this kind of information. So I'm going to just get right into it. This has been obviously in theory, I'm going to get right into it if my screen advances as it's supposed to. Just give me 1 second here. Oops. Okay, start slide. Let me just do that again. And for some reason, this is not. There we go. Okay. So looking forward at this past year. This past year was obviously a very challenging one for a large number of firms. And we know that the cause of that is fairly straightforward. We know the pandemic hit the economy at the beginning of 2020 and caused a severe disruption. And that severe disruption can be seen in any number of data sets that are all now very much screwed up, I would say, because we have an event that's in the data that's completely outside of past experience. And I kind of like to remind people of that, is that this is a recession, or was a recession, but it's very much different than the kinds of recessions that we've had in the past. I would say this is primarily a supply shock rather than a demand shock. And I think that's going to be the theme that I have going into, particularly looking forward for the rest of this year and into next year even. We had a sharp drop in jobs, we had a sharp drop in output, sharp rises in unemployment, and those things are being slowly rectified as we move through that initial phase of the shutdown and into the subsequent phases. The initial phase of the shutdown really was very much, I think, characterized by a lot of indiscriminate shutting down of activity. And so once we were able to move through that into a more discriminate approach to dealing with the pandemic, that we were able to, I think, rebound the economy fairly quickly. And that's a good sign for what could happen, I think, going forward into the next year. So again, so I'm not sure, I should have sort of gone through these a little bit more. So I'm going to just change this up. We can just do this way. All right, so one thing that has, I think, been very evident is we've had an unusual amount of fiscal stimulus in this economy, and that's going to be part of the story looking forward into next year. Real personal income surged during this pandemic as a result of support from the federal government, either in stimulus payments for just rebate checks or enhanced unemployment benefits. All of those things more than fill the hole left over from the drop that we hit during the first part of the pandemic. So real personal income, excluding those transfer payments, the green line is really the hole that needed to be filled. The blue line includes those current transfer payments that more than fill that hole. That means that really, we've actually been able to push more income into the economy than would have been the case even had we not had the pandemic at all. And that's, I think, going to be an important part of thinking about how quickly we can rebound next year. So I'm going to be talking about that. And another thing I want to talk about briefly is how there's been a real change or shift in the composition of spending during this pandemic and how that's affected firms basically in ways that we haven't seen in past recessions. So for example, in the last recession, 2007, 2009, what we saw was households really cut back on spending on goods. And what we've seen in this downturn is that households have cut back on spending on services. So for example, right, if I look at the blue line here, that's services spending, and that has dramatically dropped. And a large part of that is due to leisure and hospitality. Leisure and hospitality spending is just dramatically lower, and as a consequence, and that's partially just simply due to the fact that we can't spend into that sector. We can't buy as many restaurant meals and do as too much tourism and travel as we did before. As a consequence of that, some spending has actually shifted into good spending. So good spending here is above what we think of as the pre-recession trend. So if we look at where we were prior to the expansion, we'll certainly have exceeded the trend in good spending that we would have had. So we've had this big composition and shift in spending, and that's certainly affected different firms differently. Even within good spending too, I'd say that the e-retailers, for example, have had a big benefit, more so than local retailers. So there's been some internal shifting in that group too. So a big question that we have going into next year is how much of this reverses. A good chunk of the services spending will reverse and come back as soon as vaccinations become widely available, as soon as we can pull back the pandemic. I think there's going to be a very strong demand for exactly that kind of spending activity. We just haven't seen it quite yet. So I don't want to run out of time here, so I'm going to skip ahead here and think about why we have so many reasons for optimism, I think, going into this next year. One is that we've already had a V-shaped recovery in wages. And this is very confusing for a lot of people, given that we've had this sharp drop in employment, that even though we're still 9-10 million jobs down where we should be, we've had wages and salaries come back up. Now, this is because of the unequal nature of this downturn, is that workers that were at the lower end of the sector, particularly of the income sectors, including in particular leisure and hospitality, those were the workers that were most effective. Higher wage workers that could work from home, for example, were less affected. And so the drop in income, wages, and salaries really hit the lowest income and the sort of sectors the most, and thus we're able to create a rebound that was much quicker than what we saw in the last recession. So in the last recession, the blue line here, after the NBR, after the peak of the cycle, it took a while for wages and salaries to drop. When they did, it took 2 years to recover. This drop in wages and salaries took only a few months to recover. That's a great sign of the ability of the economy to rebound quickly. Again, once we move past the pandemic, and we can get that impacted sector of the economy running again. That's where I think the real supply shock has occurred. It's not really the capacity to buy stuff that's a problem now. Incomes are above pre-pandemic levels due to government support. It's really about the ability to spend. We can't buy some of the kinds of things that we bought prior to the pandemic. The next factor that I think is important is that the labor market is actually stronger than it appears. I've got a couple different versions of this, but one is that if we look at job openings are still very strong. Quit rates have bounced back up, which tells me workers are thinking that they can, in fact, find new jobs if they leave their jobs. And so I think that's important. If we look at the December jobs report, most of the weakness was in leisure and hospitality. In the private sector, excluding leisure and hospitality, you were still generating jobs at a rate of over 400,000 jobs a month. That's an extremely fast rate of growth. So there's a lot of rebound happening in the economy outside of that most impacted sector. And I think that's underappreciated. Number three, low interest rates are clearly going to be supportive for this expansion. The Federal Reserve has very much committed to a different policy approach than we faced in the last expansion. In the last expansion, the Federal Reserve said we're going to look at unemployment rates and see how that's impacting our forecasts of inflation. And what this led them to do was start to raise interest rates and tighten monetary policy prematurely. I think that the general sense the Fed learned is that they were actually underestimating how strong the economy could perform and how that strength could occur in the absence of inflationary pressures. And so we definitely saw that dynamic, I think, created tighter monetary policy conditions earlier in the recovery, and thus kind of slowed job growth sooner than should have happened. The Fed's committed to not making that same error in this recovery. What the Fed is doing instead is basically saying we're not going to raise interest rates until we see that inflation is actually at or above 2%. So until inflation actually gets supported a little bit more, the Fed doesn't expect to be able to raise interest rates. That's still a couple of years off by the Fed's analysis. I would like to sort of add on to that and say the deflationary forces that have kept inflation low for many years now don't seem like they're letting up. We could see in the next couple of months some snapback of inflation as we get past what we call base effects, basically some low inflation rates from last year, and some rebound in leisure and hospitality spending later this year. But those should be temporary impacts. If you want to talk about more sustained inflationary impacts, what you're really talking about there is, do we generate a cycle between higher prices and higher wages? And that's a cycle we really haven't been able to develop for decades now. So that's what you'd be looking at. The Fed's not expecting that. They're expecting to hold financial conditions very accommodative. And that's made it very cheap for firms to borrow and also supported higher stock prices, which has encouraged firms to gain capital through the stock market. And so that's been an important aspect. That has created supportive financial conditions more broadly. Stock prices are higher, inflation expectations are higher. This is not like what we saw in the wake of the last recession. In the wake of the last recession, what we saw was a financial sector that was damaged by the housing bubble collapsing. As a result, it was difficult to move capital through that through the financial sector. That's not the case now. So we don't have the same kind of damage that we did to the economy after this recession, as we did in 2007, 2009, and the subsequent recovery. Therefore, we shouldn't necessarily use the last expansion as a model for this expansion. This expansion is on much firmer ground. Related to that is the household balance sheets. After the last recession, household balance sheets were severely negatively impacted because of a loss of housing wealth. We didn't see that this time. What we saw was a number of opposite factors. Stock prices rebounded. That supported household wealth. We also saw housing prices stay strong, and that has supported housing wealth. And the other thing is that firms or individuals unable to spend and receiving lots of benefits from the government have on net created a huge stock of excess savings. One estimate that I use is over $1.5 trillion of excess savings in the economy right now. And that's a phenomenal amount of extra money just sort of sitting there on the sidelines. And that's been I think will provide support going into this next year. Households can draw down on that savings, or they can lighten up on the number of savings they would have done otherwise because they have this stockpile of assets. One thing to note is this is why you might be seeing some odd behavior in financial markets, because there's all this money sitting out there that people are looking to put to work. And so that's been a real big topic with what's been going on in some trading apps like Robinhood and some particular stocks like GameStop. So that's, I think, though, on net, a supportive element to the economy. Another issue is that housing markets have generally been red hot through much of the country. Single family units sold have dipped a little bit from this number, but really have been above trend since the recession, since the beginning of the year. We had a slight dip early in the year and then a complete recovery. So housing markets, again, very much different than what we saw in the wake of the last recession, creating a much more supportive environment for overall growth. New houses create new jobs. They also create new spending by households. When households move, you know that there's a lot of expenses that suddenly become involved as you buy new furniture, etc. So this is, I think, a large factor. And I'm going to come back to this again because there's also something else that's helping drive this. It's not just low interest rates. There's actually, I think, more secular trends that are driving this forward on a multi-year basis. There's another question or issue that I think is possibly very important, not just over this next year, but over the longer run, is have we entered into a new era of cheap energy? So if we look at the cost of wind production or solar production of electricity, those costs have dropped dramatically over recent years and actually might be the cheapest sources of energy that we have right now. That's great from a global perspective, and the fact that we can probably then start to think about how we actually deal with climate change. From an economic perspective, that's also great. Cheap energy will foster, I think, the development of a whole bunch of industries, particularly in the electrification of public transport, right? So electric cars, for example. So the more you get cheaper energy, matched with better battery potential, really opens up that entire industry in different ways than we would have imagined 10 years ago. So I think that's an optimistic way to look in the future. And also, I think it's very important to see how demographics could be very supportive going into this next year and future years. Right now, we're in what I call kind of a demographic hole, or have been in a demographic hole. So the boomer generation sort of moved, how's an easier way to say this? 10 years ago, right? As we got into the last recession, what was going on was, on a demographic story, is that the boomer generation was really being replaced by the Gen X generation. And that's the red lines, the green lines here. The lines represent basically the population by age. And what was going on was the big boomer generation was being filled in behind by the smaller Gen X generation. What that then also meant was the spending power was basically decreasing, right? As you move from that big generation to that smaller generation. Now that the youngest Gen Xers are around 40, right? And we're seeing that we're basically the subsequent years after that, the millennials are all bigger populations of people. Now that's important because once you get to that 40, 45 era, you're starting to move into your peak earning years. Right? So the generations that are starting to move into their peak earning years are now getting bigger and bigger and bigger with each year. Right? That's going to create a lot of spending power, I think, in the economy into the next decade. And it's also right now that millennial generation moving now into the bigger millennial generation moving into their home buying years, that's helped supporting the housing market on a fundamentally sustained basis, not just for this year, but I expect for the next 4 or 5 years as we move through that bubble. They're also being met with the fact that older people are staying in their homes longer. And so there's just this shortage of supply in housing right now that's creating demand for new housing activity and higher prices and supporting balance sheets. So household balance sheets. So that's a trend. And I kind of compare this now to what was happening in the 1990s. And the 1990s was when the boomers were really entering into their primary, their peak earning years. And that's a big generation suddenly hitting their earning years and then sort of marching up that hill, where every subsequent year, you got a bigger population of people moving into their peak earning years. The Gen Xers were the hole on the other side of that. Right? We're getting through that hole of the Gen Xers and into the mountain of the millennials that we're going to be climbing going forward. So I think all of those factors really point to some fundamentally good outcomes for the U.S. economy over the next couple of years, especially once we get the pandemic under control. Getting the pandemic under control is really the number one growth another one economic policy we can have to boost growth in this country. The vaccinations and moving through this winter wave, I think will really give us that room to grow into the second half of this year and 2021. So I'm going to finish up there. I think I've gone over, and I apologize for that. I try not to do that right off the bat, but we can go ahead and start up. So I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Dewey. And also Professor Dewey, Shanti, Yvonne, and Marianne, please go ahead and share your video and go off mute. So it's what a difference 1 year, I should say 9 months, a year makes in the news, going from the world is ending to we have a lot of bright spots to celebrate and to look forward to. And thank you again, Professor Dewey. Moving now from the economic forecast to the business and technology world of 2021 and 2022, let's go ahead and start our panel discussion. As promised, Marianne, why don't you start us off? Please go ahead and introduce us and your role, please.
Sure. My name is Marianne Patel. I'm a VP of Product Management at Salesforce. So if you've ever used Salesforce, whether it's tracking your deals, logging your opportunities, tracking your activities, all of those products are the things that I own.
And Yvonne.
Hi, I'm Director of Chrome Hardware Engineering at Intel Corporation, and my job is to work with Google to develop the next generation hardware that the Chrome OS runs on. And of course, Intel itself produces a lot of personal or server computing products that goes into a lot of the servers and people's devices. And I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I have a son who is actually attending the Lundquist College of Business at U of O.
Nice, nice. Thank you. And Shanti.
Hi, my name is Shanti Burgill. I'm the founding managing director of a venture capital firm called the Transcend Fund. We focus on video games and game-related high-growth businesses. We invest globally on all gaming platforms. It's about a $50 million early stage fund, and I'm located in London, England.
And thank you again for staying up late with us today. Well, let's jump right into our first question. Just to give you folks an idea of the format, we have some prepared questions. And as we go through those prepared questions, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Time is always short, but feel free, and we'll try to weave those through. And then we have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of this program. So turning back to the business environment for 2021, what are your reactions to this economic forecast as it relates to the tech industry? And this regarding, how do economic fluctuations impact what you do in the short term and the long term? Yvonne, turning to you, you had mentioned to me a couple weeks ago, your division had a major year-over-year growth for 2020. You want to talk a little bit about that and what you're looking for 2021?
Yeah, sure. So, looking at our latest earnings report, for year 2020, our, Intel's server business in volume went up 11%, where our projection right before that, it was, a single-digit growth. And for our, client desktop business actually, went down by about 10%, but our notebook volume, went up by 28%. So you can see how the, the COVID effect, of working from home, remote, and that had a lot of effect on, our hardware sales and also a lot of the services. And we, Intel, I think it was an industry issue, Intel actually had some supply issues because we just could not meet demand. And from the Chromebook business, I think, we grew about 50% in volume, It was a jump, and in Q2, I believe our volume went up, actually doubled. And so, if this trend, but we see it kind of like flattening out, If we can all go back to work and, people can, kids can go back to school, that type of IT or, notebook spending might flatten out, but we still see there, pockets in some markets, that still have potential.
Thank you, Yvonne. Turning to you, Shanti, we in the industry often depend on the beginning of growth as, you know, at the venture capital stage, and you are driving your own fund. You had mentioned to me a couple weeks ago that each individual yearly economic cycle doesn't necessarily impact what you do. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're investing in, and where sort of the economic cycle, how that does impact your business and your investments?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that affect us directly. So games as a business have been on call it a 50-year slow growth cycle that has kicked into high gear probably over the last 10 years or so, primarily with the advent of mobile gaming, which took off at a higher rate of growth than anything we've ever seen before in the games business. But we have multiple kind of threads that feed into the games business, whether it's PC, console, mobile, now cloud gaming, VR gaming. So there's a lot of nuanced and kind of subcategories within gaming, whether it's the platforms or the individual kind of game categories. And so all of those contribute to kind of a growth cycle that stands outside of the pandemic and outside of tech cycles in some ways. And so, we are insulated as an industry from some of the things that affect, quote unquote, normal businesses. That said, it's still, like a business that depends on consumer spend. And so as consumer spend goes away, then, there is a larger downturn. And that has happened once or twice in the kind of slow march up and to the right in the games business. The pandemic was not one of those moments. The pandemic actually was highly accretive to the games business. Not surprisingly, because everyone was stuck at home, they kind of downloaded games, they watched Netflix, and so the games business was kind of a perverse beneficiary, unfortunately, of the pandemic. And so the core dynamics haven't changed, but the business did go on fast forward a little bit, like what Yvonne was mentioning at Intel. We've seen a different version of that across our portfolio. And as we think about the growth of the business, we think in those two cycles combined. So we think about the long, kind of cycle for games itself, which is extremely bright in terms of its future. The growth of the audience, the growth of ways to play, the growth of ways to discover games. These are all, kind of advantaged by cloud computing and mobile and all the underlying dynamics that we see. So that trend is rock solid. All of the other kind of economic factors on top of them, we watch, but we don't watch as carefully as we watch the specialized things that affect us more directly and more primarily.
Thank you, Shanti. Turning back to you, Professor Dewey, how is corporate America signaling its intentions for 2021 and 2022 now that they see a light at the economic end of the tunnel?
Well, you can certainly see where firms are actually more optimistic than I think you would expect. So, for example, with core durable goods spending, so spending for not capital goods that are non-defense and non-aircraft have really rebounded strongly. And that is a good sign that firms are planning for expansion into this next year and into subsequent years. They're not being deterred by the pandemic. And the reason that's occurring is because so much of the damage is so sector specific to leisure and hospitality. But even in those sectors, firms are starting to say, okay, well, what's going to happen in the fall and in the winter when we're moved through this phase of the pandemic, we've got greater vaccinations. So I think there's a lot of positioning for stronger growth later this year. And I think that's really the way to think about it, is that you can sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. So what should we be doing now to address the fact that our business could be up substantially by the end of this year?
Planning for that for the bump in sales, as well as probably most people on this webinar would like to be planning their next vacation as well. some haven't gotten out for more than almost a year. Yvonne, does a potential stock market drop impact your 2021 and 2022 plan, and if so, how?
Yeah, so personally, right, if the stocks I own go down, right, by a substantial amount in value, then of course I'm gonna tighten up, right, my spending and probably not gonna go buy anything or go travel. But and also from a business perspective, right, you can probably see a shift in segments, right. Consumers will probably shift from the higher end products to lower end, which means, right, you shift from a higher margin to a lower margin. And so that has some business impact, right? Even though maybe volume will be up, but the lower margin segments, right, will generate less profit margin.
Yvonne, staying with you, what are some of the impacts perhaps on the healthcare industry and associated technology firms? You had some thoughts there that you wanted to share, both health tech, health insurance, insurtech. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, something that makes me wonder, I'm not sure if there's discussion going on, right? How did COVID impact the health insurance industry, right? Or the hospitals, right? Because of all these, patients, we have to care for. And, what's the real impact to that? And also, a lot of us probably have seen our doctors, right, online now, like our virtual doctor appointment, right? So I think clinics and hospitals are also working to try to catch up, right, on technology to make sure, right, they can support their patients virtually. And this is why it become, right, the new norm, right? And I think the industry have been trying to, right, go more on the virtual. They have the nurse hotline, or they have the, right, the online doctor. But I think now this will actually become, right, the new norm for the medical field. And also a lot of, right, there's still probably a lot of vaccine research going on, and so, right, a lot of the research tools, computing, right, AI, that type of development will still be growing.
Thank you. And the vaccine, I actually thinking about Salesforce announced yesterday a vaccine cloud. That was pretty exciting. Marianne, turning to you now, some of the folks here might be also thinking about their personal careers. You hire, as part of your normal everyday role and to grow and build your team. How should tech professionals as well as job seekers positions themselves for this changed economic environment?
I think that tech workers are actually in a great shape right now with this changing economic environment. I think job postings are through the roof, frankly. A lot of customers are really thinking about, with COVID, it's pushed their timeline for how they're thinking about digital transformation forward dramatically. And so they're investing in what is the technology that enables us to scale, what's the technology that enables us to carry through a recession and then grow as well with it. And so anyone in this space, I think, is actually set up pretty well for success. It's all about knowing how to pitch yourself, being aware, of course, that you are at home and you're having all those interviews and trying to gain relationships in a remote setting. But I think everyone is very well positioned, actually.
That's encouraging to hear. Yvonne, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yes, I think, that the job market to me kind of basically just opened up, right, to everybody, because a lot of jobs are going remote. So there's no, right, constraint on location, and, people can work from everywhere. And so the amount of, right, opportunity percentage-wise, right, has grown for, for the average, right, job seeker. So really, right, be flexible and really, look for a job openings, not just in your local area, right? Really expand your job search to wherever you would basically look at the company or look at the industry that you'd like to work in.
Thank you. And now, Shanti, how do recent grads and other job seekers find a new job and advance their career really during, again, this difficult time in the economic cycle, even though tech is doing pretty well? It seems like everything is virtual and online, and traditional sort of in-person networking isn't an option. Do you have any advice on what to do for those looking for their next career move, especially those in the beginning of their career trying to break into the tech industry?
Yeah, I think as has been said, there is a flattening of opportunity as a result of more work being done remotely in tech. And so your access level, I think, is encouragingly up and increased. The other thing that's nice about the internet is that you have access to an amazing array of resources. You know, the things that are available, for example, about the subjects that I'm kind of spend all my time worried about, are available on the internet in ways that they never were when I was in a similar position, kind of getting my first job out of university. And it's been said, I think it was one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, he talked about every skill needs 10,000 hours of practice in order to master it. I think as a younger person coming up now, if you pick a focus and you are able to spend those hours trying to master something, you could walk in the door to your very first job with a lot more expertise than the generation that came before you. And if you're focused enough, you might actually have expertise that puts you in a very privileged position vis-a-vis some of the other candidates, because you'll be just tailored for exactly that need. In my world, like that could be technical skills if you're an engineer, if you're an artist, and you specialize in a particular kind of effect or kind of 3D art package, those are all possibilities. And so I think the ability to focus and learn remotely using the internet as your kind of resource, I think, is unprecedented and helpful if you want to apply yourself and try and hit the ground running at one of these companies that has these opportunities.
And well, I'll open this up to everyone. We have a question from the audience. As a career generalist whose full-time position was lost due to COVID, what are some strategies to better present myself to tech hiring managers? Does anyone have a thought there?
As someone who has never actually specialized in anything but is a master of being a generalist, I will say, for me, it was really about shaping my narrative. I've been an engineer, an engineering manager, a product marketer, a PM, and every hat in between. And I think it's really understanding what the company needs, reaching out and figuring out what that role looks like at that company. The title PM, the title even VC, means something different at every single firm and every single job, and even every single business unit. And so figuring out how to frame your journey to map what they are looking for and how you hit all the skills along the way, even though you never had the title. I've done that with every job I've had, and I highly recommend it.
This could very well be an entire 90-minute session just on this topic. And there's so many great questions coming in, and we will definitely try to get to more of them from the audience at the end of this program. We'll just go quickly to move on to topic number 2. And no webinar would be complete in the last year without talking about COVID. So we'll go ahead and get that one through. Now, again, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A feature. Now, Professor Dewey, how are executives planning for when and how we return to the workplace, and specifically workplace in tech? It's very big here in the Bay Area, but also elsewhere. When can we actually see ourselves back in the office, and will that nature be changed?
Right, and this has been a big question. I'll talk to employers that will say that their employees will quit if they're required to come back down to the office. And that's a big change. There's certainly some employees that want to be back in the office, but they don't necessarily want to be back there all the time. They want some additional flexibility. And that's what I think we're going to be moving toward in the sort of new office environment of the future. I think there's always been a desire for that flexibility, but there's been a problem with firms. They've been unwilling to really accept that flexibility because they've been worried about the productivity challenges. But what a lot of firms are finding out is their workers are more productive when they're out of the office. And so that's been a big sea change. So I think what you're going to see is firms move to more, increasingly more of a mixed office environment where mixed work from home. Like maybe you come into the office 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week. And I think there will be some importance to that to maintain cultural connections with your employer. And because I think people will want to be out of the home every once in a while too. So I think you'll see smaller square footages, maybe more office floor plans, more what hot cotting, what I call hot cotting, but more shared office space, as really things that office managers are going to be thinking about or going forward as sort of making that transition to the post-COVID world. And I think that will happen in the latter half of this year. Again, it's all dependent upon the speed at which we can move vaccinations into the general public.
Right, thank you, Professor Dewey. Yvonne, what's Intel's plans, or perhaps others in your network?
Mhm. For Intel, I've been hearing, and I think our HR has been sharing, is we're gonna probably go with a hybrid, right, type of work environment. And Intel's business is very diverse, right? We have from the fabrication plants where you just have to be there, right, to maybe purely software or some marketing, or some jobs that can be 100% remote. So it really depends on the job, your role at Intel, and and some of us have to spend some time in the labs, right, to work on our projects. So we're working on this kind of really a hybrid, and we're taking a phased approach, right, to see when we slowly let employees get back on site, or like Professor Dewey mentioned, maybe a part-time, right? You go back on site part-time. And also we're there are plans to see, hey, do we want to set aside some budget for, right, people who are going to, right, work from home permanently, right? How do we help them set up their office properly? So it's very interesting. And then I think a lot of business travel will also resume, right? Maybe not as much as before, because we've had this COVID experience, and now we think, hey, maybe there's some of things can be accomplished without traveling. But the human interaction, right, is still very important sometimes in the business, in business relationship. So we see that coming back as well. And also a lot of employees, I mean, some people will be fine, right, 100%, not have talking to anybody, right? But most of us would crave that human interaction. And then beginning of COVID, we're like, okay, we're planning for, say, conferences or employee resource group meetings, and it's like, okay, when we go back to work, which is probably meant 2 to 4 weeks, to if we go back to work, right? And now I can feel some sort of excitement, or expectation on, oh, when we go back to work, right, which is in a few months, people, you can kind of feel the change in a tone, and how we start planning things. And also, when we met earlier, right, to prep for this panel, Professor Dewey was like, yeah, I'm good, talking into a void, right? So in a conference situation, if you're a speaker, you kind of crave that audience feedback, right? Or you need that audience feedback. And now in this situation, it's like, for also for me, I'm talking right to my laptop. So yeah, we see this this is going to be a mix.
Can I add on that too? Is there a couple of things that occurred to me? There's corporations or firms are going to have to think about how they do their salary or differential salary, or whether they want to do differential salary or not. And I can see where this could have some very disrupting impacts on local labor markets, at least initially. So for example, if you're an employee in the Bay Area, and you say, okay, well, I can do work from home or wherever, and I can collect my Bay Area salary and move to Portland, that means that you've got now very high income workers in Portland that are basically setting that will be essentially setting the local job market salaries. And so that will tend to pull upward pressure on Portland salaries in theory. So there could be some interesting dynamics that emerge in these as firms sort of figure out what the right salary should be. Does it sort of smooth out to a more uniform salary over time? So that's something to work for. And the other thing I think people are going to have to think about is work from home tends to be very good for people that are mid-career or late career, that already have their connections, already have, their experience set up, might not be that great for early career people that need to be worked into the corporate culture. So that's another reason why I don't think full work from home is the ultimate answer. Then that's why I kind of think these hybrid models, as Yvonne was talking about, are probably the way that the future will tend.
Professor Dewey, in that same vein, what shifts will we see enabled by technology that impact urban centers like the San Francisco Bay Area? What should we anticipate moving forward? And we had a question from the audience member: should they buy a home in San Francisco?
I saw that. And I'll be interested to hear what our other panelists think. So the downtown areas have a real problem on their hands, is that they are set up to absorb a vast amount of workers every day. And they've created a whole ecosystem around those workers for dining, hospitality, entertainment. And it's not clear that ecosystem is going to be the same going forward. Again, if we're only going to work, half time, that's half your customer base on any given day downtown, and that will shift the amenities that are available, and it might shift some of those to outlying regions. And I don't think we have a good handle on what that means necessarily for the amenities, for what it should be a downward put downward pressure on office costs, for example, all these trends. So I think we're going to have to work our way through that, and then where people locate. One reason to be located downtown is the amenities and the proximity to your employment. If the amenities are not there in the same amount, and you don't need to be close to your employment, where do you locate? And the Bay Area question is interesting because the Bay Area was a very expensive place, and a lot of employees are finding, again, if you can get your Bay Area salary and move to Missoula, they're starting to think about that option. So I don't know where that plays out as far as when housing prices sort of stabilize around some new equilibrium. But there's definitely a new equilibriums, I think, being established in these major metropolitan areas.
It's interesting for the Bay Area. It looks like generally the housing market for sales, buying and selling, has generally been stable. Rentals, however, down significantly over the last 12 months. But actually in the last 30 days, looks like it has reached bottom and starting to rebound in the rental market also. While we're on the subject of remote work, for Yvonne, Marianne, Shanti, has your experience been also reflected by that remote work has increased productivity? How have your teams and your organization generally dealt with work from home? Has it been challenging, or are you seeing an increase in productivity as well? And what do you see for the near term, for the near future?
I guess I'll start. At Salesforce, obviously, we have a very large Ohana with over 50,000 people, and some of our offices are open in other countries, but in the US, they're entirely closed. I will say we definitely saw a big dip in productivity initially. We are a company, though, that leads with our values, and one of the things that we really focused on in the beginning was about employee mental health, well-being, bringing in sort of thought leaders and others on how to sort of manage that change. I think we've been very specific as an organization in terms of how do we shift our frankly very meeting heavy culture into an online world, and what does and doesn't need to happen in meetings. I think we haven't figured it out yet. For our younger workforce that does not have children, they have been very productive. Some of our engineers are writing twice as much code. As someone who is a parent of a young child who was at home in kindergarten, figuring out online school, I would say it was highly disruptive to most of the people sort of at the management layer, because we were all juggling so many different things at the same time. I think we have largely rebounded from that shift, but what we are really seeing is that the employee mental health, stress, and burnout have really sort of hit its limit, right? Adrenaline can only take you so far. and that probably ran out in August or so of last year. Everyone was rejuvenated with the holidays, but I think that's really where companies are trying to figure out that balance. So, for example, we do a TMP Wellbeing Day every day across the entire tech, prod, and marketing organizations at Salesforce. So once a month we do those at least, and it's a time where we as an organization have decided that that's the best way to sort of enforce. Time off is when everyone takes it off, but I think these are the types of discussions that frankly leaders have never had to have before, and that we need to have as more of our work culture of checking in, knowing people better. I have really enjoyed getting to know my team better. I know them better personally now than I ever was. And I think you're more invested, when you see their cat and their ailing mother and the other things that they are dealing with in their life. I think it actually makes us better employers when we do have the opportunity to listen and to see how they bring their whole selves to work.
Next time I'll bring my cat along. But how about Shanti or Yvonne? Any thoughts there as far as productivity? Shanti, I saw you added a new member to your team in the last 24 hours. Any thoughts for productivity and being entirely virtual?
Yeah, so that is a big increase for us. We were a 2-member team and now we're a 3-member team. So it's a huge upgrade. Yeah, I think just to pick up on the point that Marianne was bringing up, I think the humanity of the situation is interesting because I think we've all seen our coworkers' kids now, and it does change things to some degree. But in our experience running a portfolio of startup companies kind of tend to move fast, be fairly remote friendly to begin with, just for cost reasons. If for nothing else, they have to outsource sometimes to kind of lower cost parts of the world. Some of our portfolio companies are in lower cost parts of the world, and so we are kind of remote with them. And the dynamic of having everyone unable to interact directly in the office, it has a time limit. It has a timestamp for creative industries. So when you're making a game together, there's a lot of last mile problems that don't get solved very well at a distance like this. And so while I think a lot of the early days, what we heard from most people was that, the positives, frankly, that hey, we can actually do this, and we can get our jobs done, was kind of like the first wave of feedback, kind of functionally check, it works. The second wave was like, oh, I can actually do even more than I used to, because if I'm meeting heavy, I can stack meetings back to back, and I don't have to even, kind of go to the office anymore, so I can save that half hour, whatever it was. And so people did more and more, and that's where the burnout kicked in. And people started to realize that, oh, I probably do need to figure out, like my nutrition and my, like my outdoor, kind of schedule, and, kind of when I should turn off and not answer email anymore. And that, I think, has played through as well. But I think the final thing that, there's just no getting around for some of our founders anyway, is that the level of quality for the product that you can ship in this configuration is problematic. So it's not as high. Things slip through that wouldn't if you were, like able to look over your coworker's shoulder and overhear something that somebody's saying at the desk down at the end of the row. And so there are, particularly in small teams, I think that serendipity effect gets lost, and it is noticeable after a while when you spend cycle after cycle, month after month, and you find yourself kind of like wondering, why there's more bugs or why this, kind of isn't quite feeling right. And so, I do think that we have seen waves of kind of understanding and revelation and dealing with it through the pandemic. But I do know, like if you're an introvert, like you've adjusted a certain way and you're probably better than if you're an extrovert and you kind of can't wait to get back into the office. But I do think that like the new normal will have to include kind of more personal interactivity, for business reasons as well as personal.
Yvonne, any final thoughts there on that question?
Yeah, very, very similar, right? Observation, compared to Marianne and Shanti's. And also my personal experience, right? I am the accompanist of the choir locally, and we haven't met right in person, to sing for over a year now, and our choir tour to Italy, has been postponed twice now, and so this morale wise for the choir, right, is really productivity is basically right, just right on the floor, and really that human interaction and being able to get together sometimes for certain right job roles or certain product groups or is very very important, and yeah, it just I think it hits right different roles differently.
Thank you. My next question is about changing changing behavior in tech. Working from home, as we've been talking about, consumption of consumer goods, business travel, and so on. What do you think is the sort of the most significant permanent change that won't go back to the way it was in 2018, 2019? Any thoughts?
I think to earlier Yvonne's point about and Dr. Dewey's point about labor markets, I think that fluidity and the acceptance that you can get work done, and that location boundaries are no longer a limit. I think it expands what's possible for people. I think it changes how we have to bring organizations online, how we have to coach people, how we have to train people. I feel like all of those changes are here for good across the landscape, not just tech, and I think for the better. I think it requires us to tune in and listen more than we have ever in the past and really be conscientious about our intentions. And I think that's a good change.
Marianne, while we're on that subject, you is hiring people on a day-to-day basis. It's almost like a different skill set. What are those skills that you look for, whether it be seasoned executives or people all the way down to straight out of school that are looking to break into tech? What are those skill sets that you look for that make them successful in this new reality? And how do they position themselves to ensure that they're showing you that they have those skills?
Especially in my role in product, one of the things that we have to do is we have to broker a lot of conversations. We are that connection point between the business, between engineering, design, and other people. We used to always look for people who were technically on their game, who could speak the language, learn skills quickly. I would say that has not changed at all, but the ability to then effectively communicate and listen, I think, are more important than ever. I run our associate product manager program at Salesforce, which recruits directly out of undergrad. And I would say the same skills we look for them are the skills that we look for in our senior executives that we're hiring as well, which is really the ability to be that authentic leader, to be very self-aware, to be able to communicate concisely, to listen to other people, and to be able to intuit the things that you naturally get, frankly, more signal to noise ratio with when you're in person. So how do I read someone's body language? How do I effectively communicate with them? How do I make sure that my message is landing with them and that their message is landing with me? I think those skills are more important than ever, and something we've been interested in the past to make you just frankly a more effective leader, but now I think they're number one and number two most important things.
Thank you. And now that we're talking about different habits and changing tech culture, how should we think about, really be thinking about how COVID has changed the actual client, cloud and client computing and team collaboration as it relates to both the technology? What are the impacts on hardware and software infrastructure to enable these new services? Yvonne, you had a personal story of really your most recent role and right before the pandemic started.
Yeah. So I started this new role in February last year, and so a month into my job, I hadn't really built my relationship with people, and I had travel scheduled to travel to India, Taiwan, and even California to meet my peers or my customers. But all of a sudden COVID happened and everybody just went poof, right? So, I had to spend extra energy to stay connected with others, to actually build new relationship, new connection, with people I have to work with. And so that, became very interesting experience. And I'm an introvert, by nature, and so it was especially hard. I had to spend extra energy to have to push myself to get connected and stay connected. And I also lead a team, and so I also need to make sure I stay connected with them as well. And so that's kind of my personal side of story on how you work in this remote environment. But also, right, I learned about like we all mentioned before, right, everybody is going online, and so there's a jump, right, in everybody wants to buy a laptop, or everybody wants to buy a Chromebook. And also schools and right companies, they have to start beefing up, still, right, make sure their infrastructure can support, right, this type of growth. And and everything, right, is stored in the cloud, right, for easy access. So security, right, becomes very important, and privacy as well, right? So you don't want your data, or your personal information leak out. And a lot of things like that. So technology, hardware wise, right, that that we've seen a lot of growth in there. And also, right, 5G is also a very important technology we're pushing, right, because that enables edge devices, even our consumer devices, to do some of the data processing, and to right, to alleviate the bottleneck, right, on the network, routers or servers. And so a lot of this, we still see a lot of growth in hardware or software that's related to data processing and security, and most importantly, right, artificial intelligence, right, how you say route data, or how you present data intelligently.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Marianne, I wanted to just make sure I circle back with you as we're still talking about the cloud, client computing, and team collaboration. Anything from the Salesforce perspective that has really leapt forward over the last year, and perhaps what do you look forward to in 2021?
Yeah, I think last year we saw more phones than ever at Salesforce have been ringing. C-suites, CIOs, CEOs, CFOs, they have been reaching out to us because of our reputation as a company, and for doing right by our customers and the success of our customers. And really, we only grow when our customers grow, and when they use our products. I think it's really opened up a lot of opportunities for us to have those conversations, like you see work.com and what we've done with Vaccine Cloud, areas that frankly I never imagined that we as a company would go. It allows us to really bring those connections together. But on the B2B side, we see people really revamping how they're focused on buying solutions. Before, we saw them buying point solutions. So let's buy one solution from this vendor for my call integration, another one for how I'm logging activities, another one for connecting my email. Now we definitely see companies moving towards platform level investments, to Yvonne's point. How do I make sure that the person who is in charge of my data is doing something intelligent with my data, helping me report on my data, and helping me build applications on top of that? And so we really see a lot more investment in how do I think about digital transformation as a whole versus small siloed efforts to sort of move the needle forward. Everyone knows that this is now an imperative like it never was before.
Thank you, Marianne. Shanti, thinking about from your perspective as a venture capital guy, what are you looking at in the near term and maybe the medium term that perhaps you wouldn't have looked at even 6 months ago based on the changing landscape?
I think one of the most interesting things about the changing landscape, particularly in application software in general, but in games specifically, is the ability to care less about the underlying technology and to focus more on the experience delivered. So I think a lot of the great work that gets done at the lower levels in the tech stack has gotten the overall, the overall experience to a point where content creation, is leveled up and is in the hands of more and more people, to the point where complete amateurs can make games. They can make content on the internet and distribute it in a whole interesting variety of ways. So some of the most interesting things that are going on in games and in kind of mixed media in general have to do with, it's called user-generated content. So the ability of people who are players of the game to actually make things in the game, or to use tools that are easy to find to kind of create things that allow them to contribute in a creative way to the fandom that they're part of. And so franchises that you might have seen where this has already happened, things like Minecraft, Roblox, The Sims, these are all places where people can actually make things in the games that they already play, and you don't have to be aware of the technology at all. There are new waves of that concept coming. Some of those are venture funded. And those are intentionally trying to leverage the fact that you don't have to care about the underlying stack anymore. So the underlying stack has gotten so good that it is so mass market. Everyone has a mobile phone. The cloud is available. You can basically assume as a software developer that that stuff is there for you, and then everything else you can build on top of it. And then if you read all the way out on that trend line, you see things like TikTok, for example, where people are making kind of videos and posting them and distributing them globally and becoming famous and all of this. These are all part of this kind of trend about people being able to apply the technology finally to their interests. And so it's not about, like when I first started in the kind of tech industry, I had to kind of learn how to edit kind of .bat and .sys files on my MS-DOS machine in order to make the thing work at all. And so those days are way, way over. And so anybody with a mobile phone can do a lot of interesting things just with that phone, let alone kind of all the other stuff. And so when we look at kind of the future of digital entertainment, that's a very big part of it. Is it's increasing divorce from the technology cycle at all.
It's almost like the democratization of production of games or digital content, where almost anybody can do it, and as well as monetize it on various different platforms. What about other streaming content, Shanti? Are there any changes in major platforms due to the stay-at-home that we should look forward to over the next 12 to 18 months?
There's a lot more of them, so there's that. So there's a lot of platforms that probably the average person isn't aware of, depending on what your interests are. So if you're into music, you're probably aware of a certain segment. If you're into games, you might be aware of a different segment. If you're into gardening and bird watching, you've probably got your own as well. But the big ones that everybody is aware of are all up and to the right, of course. But I think the secret is that all of them are up and to the right, actually. And part of that has to do with what has been discussed around everyone wanting to reach out and not being able to. So we're an investor in a company called Bunch, which does video overlays on top of games and allows people to play games together. And so you're able then to kind of have kind of game night with your extended family through this application. And so experiences like that across everybody's interests, I think, are increasing. And streaming is a fundamental kind of building block of that. It's just now down to who's able to put those blocks together in ways that access large groups of people. And so the first ones are the obvious ones, but new ones are coming.
Exciting stuff. 2021 is going to be very, very busy. And we are almost out of time here for the sort of prepared questions. And for those of you in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature. We'll just got one or two more questions, and then we'll try to get to as many of those as possible in the next 10, 15 minutes. I just sort of, one of the last questions I had for the panel, sort of your favorite area of brightness of growth. What to you in the 12 to 18 months ahead, what to you is a bright spot? I'll just name off a few. For example, U.S. wireless carriers have pushed 5G network deployments. Handsets are out there. widely available. Work at home has increased the demand for intensive applications, I should say. In 2020 was the year of a kickoff year for 5G, and it's really the party's just getting started. For example, self-driving cars in many other cases will drive user adoption in advanced wireless networks. Now, you folks have your hands in many different areas. If I could just go around, starting with Professor Dewey, what's the most bright spot for you in the next 12 to 18 months that we should really be paying attention to?
Well, I talked about the green energy situation and the collapsing price of energy already. And so I think that's, one place to keep an eye on. It sort of fits with some of the technologies you talked on. And then from pure cyclical point of view, leisure and hospitality, tourism and travel should snap back and be pretty aggressive here going forward too. So those are kind of, a broad, tech sort of thing, and I think the cyclical thing that's going to be a real boost here going forward.
Cool. And Yvonne?
Yeah, the bright spot, I would say, still a lot more technology growth, right? Like you mentioned earlier, Nick, that there's a lot of build out and a lot of, markets that aren't still saturated yet. And of course, the job market will open up, right, in these areas to fulfill the need, right, of talent and also resources to build these, hardware infrastructure out. And another one is really, I see a lot of probably conference, trade show spending will come back, right? Because once we can go face to face again, all these will come back to life. And usually, right, these are, to some companies and some conferences, right? It's a really big ticket item. So I see that come back.
Thank you, Yvonne. Marianne?
For me, I think it's just that we are all embracing a new way of working, and that will forever change sort of the labor market and the landscape of opportunities for people.
That's perhaps that's the title for our next webinar right there. And then, thank you, Marianne. And finally, Shanti.
I'm easy. I think you know my answer already. Games have been on an amazing growth curve for the last year. That's going to continue. We're very happily kind of riding that wave, and we will continue to do so.
Cool. And I'll just jump immediately into questions from the audience. Apologies that we ran a little bit over, but we'll try to get to as many of these as possible. First question is for Marianne and from the audience. Has Salesforce seen a change in usage over the past 12 months? I think I know the answer to that, but I would love to hear that from you.
Yeah, I actually typed in my answer. I said, yes, usage is up in some areas. It's definitely skyrocketed in other areas that we own. We've definitely seen that any tools that enable people to collaborate more are being used more efficiently. So even, something as simple as, one of our tools is enabling you to track your activities. We have seen people require that data to be in Salesforce and to tie compensation to that. Like, that's a very tactical use. Obviously, we are still two separate companies, but the acquisition of Slack, definitely shows you that engagement and where people are working has shifted to online platforms like that as well.
Thank you. This is for the entire panel. Do the panelists have any advice on supplemental learning and mentoring because of less in-person opportunities to do so? How can we connect people who need mentoring or are looking for mentoring for those that might be willing to do that?
Yeah, I can take this one. If you're in a school, right, reach out to professors, TAs, or friends, right? At work, similar things, managers, or there are employee resource group, or even HR, right, to see if they can help you connect to somebody else. And outside, there's a ton of resources, right? I use, LinkedIn, or I'm part of, say, Society of Women Engineers, or, Anita Borg, organization. There's a lot of, right, online learning, or even TED, right? It's a lot of resources out there that, or YouTube, that would give you, ideas and pointers on, right, how to, get more resources. But I think the first thing you need to do is to reach out and to go look.
Yeah, there's another place here too. So your local, whatever your local tech organization or your local chamber of commerce will often have some kind of mentoring program as well. And so those are probably, I think, still active, and so I see a lot of those kinds of opportunities out there.
I would also say, don't be afraid to reach out to people who you think are out of reach. So if you have somebody who you look up to in your specialization, or your industry, or your hero, or whomever, in my experience, those people are actually more accessible than you might think. And they're not accessible to everyone on all terms. I don't think we're all going to get Tim Cook at Apple to be our personal mentor, but I think it is surprising when you reach out to people who are busy and successful. If you have a really compelling kind of story that hits them the right way, they will spend time with you, in my experience. So, don't be afraid to, go a little farther than you might think is allowed.
And
And I often tell people, the worst answer you get back is no, or sorry, I don't have time.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yep.
Right. I'd also encourage the audience to use LinkedIn. It's such a powerful tool that pretty much everyone is on. I do engage with folks when time is available, especially those that are graduates of the University of Oregon. I try to help the alma mater, and I know a lot of other folks do. That's what Ducks in Tech and the UO Alumni Association is all about, is really helping folks after they graduate. And we don't always have a physical infrastructure, but we have a virtual infrastructure. I think that Megan will talk a little bit later, right at the bottom of the hour, talking about how to connect. And for those that have chosen to share their contact information or their LinkedIn profile, you'll get that information of those that attended this webinar. And certainly I did, and you folks are welcome to reach out. And it's a paying it forward. People helped me, and I'm sure the other folks here on the panel, people helped us get to where we are today by providing guidance and so on. And that's what we need to do now more than ever. Just moving quickly to the next question. I have a few more. This question is for both Marianne and Yvonne. I have heard a lot of disruptive tech leaders recently criticizing the MBAization of today's tech workforce. How do candidates' graduate degree influence your decision when making hiring? Do you focus on those with MBAs only, or do you not care? Who would like to go first?
I have an MBA. I actually usually try not to hire MBAs. I think that as someone with an MBA, I think my MBA really taught me how to frame my experience, give me perspectives outside of my tech bubble that I was in. I specifically went to a school that actually wasn't tech proximal for that reason. But I definitely think that a lot of MBAs are ex-consultants or people who have thought about strategy but haven't worked boots on the ground. And in a product role, you really need the technical expertise as well as the business acumen in order to succeed. And so for me, the graduate degree is like a nice checkbox, but it doesn't really tell me anything more than just the way that you show up, the way that you answer questions, your strategic thinking and your conciseness. I don't think that my MBA necessarily gave me those things. I think it just helped me better articulate them.
Thank you. Yvonne?
Yeah, I agree with Marianne. A lot of times we use a, degree or school, right, as a screening mechanism, but recently we realized, right, that's, really not an effective way of doing it. And so what we look at, right, is really, like Marianne already mentioned, right, your background, your experience, and really, your soft skills, I would say, lack of better word, right? It's how you communicate, how you present yourself, how you work with others, especially it's very important now, right, in this remote situation. And so, we try to look, at the full package, and of course, your education, gives you, right, more background, or maybe some more skills than others who might not have gone through grad school, but I think a lot of the skills can be learned, right? And what you learn from the books is sometimes very different from the real world.
Well said. Final thought, final quick question to all four of you. What are you most optimistic about in 2021 and 2022? I want to start with Professor Dewey.
I'm optimistic that we can move beyond the pandemic and see a lot of these exciting new opportunities take shape.
Shanti?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a flavor of that for sure. I don't think there's everything else is going to be secondary, but try and pick something that's secondary. No, sorry, can't. It's definitely looking forward to being out of the pandemic.
Cool. Yvonne?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Dewey, right? It's this is going to be over, right? And there's like at the end of the tunnel, and for me is optimistic about, hey, I can go travel, I can take vacation, right? And people in general will feel better about themselves and the situation, and I get to hug people again.
I like that. I like that. And finally, Marianne.
Hugging people is actually the number one thing that I look forward to, that and dinner parties with my friends. I actually will be the contrarian and say, I don't think that we're going to leave the pandemic this year. And I think there are going to be lasting effects for a long time. And I think the sooner we sort of embrace that normal will be different forever, and that we go back to sort of the things that we've learned this year, which is that relationships matter, people matter, and that like being true to yourself and true to other people is actually the thing that will carry you forward and frankly make us more successful.
Words to live by. Thank you. With that, I apologies to those that have asked questions and we weren't able to get to them due to time. Again, let Megan talk a little bit more about that. But with that, I'd like to acknowledge Marianne Patel, Professor Tim Dewey, Shanti Burgell, and Yvonne Yang. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, your insights, and your experience with the audience today. Thank you to the University of Oregon Alumni Association for their sponsorship and support bringing this program to you. Specifically, I'd like to thank Megan McKinney, Caitlin Elwood, and Lauren Barkley for their invaluable time and energy making this happen. And thank you to the audience members for attending as well. 2020 was not an easy year, but we can finally see light at the end of the tunnel. We wish you a healthy and successful year ahead. Now I'll hand it back to Megan of the University of Oregon Alumni Association for a few closing remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for moderating our event today. And to the entire panel, again, thank you on behalf of the Alumni Association for your time and for your contribution to these discussions. And to our audience, I want to encourage you to connect with fellow attendees after this event is over. So please be on the lookout for a follow-up email early next week containing a list of attendees who I hope that you'll consider reaching out to in the spirit of networking to make new professional connections. And we will also be providing you with a recording of today's webinar. And lastly, if you're looking for ways to get involved with the Alumni Association, I encourage you to stop by our website. We were going to pop the link into the chat box right down there. And on our website, you can fill out a Get Involved form. You can view a lineup of upcoming events, learn about our regional alumni chapters and affinity groups, and explore some of the benefits of becoming a member of the UO Alumni Association. And with that, I want to thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week and go Ducks.